This is the Tamron 17-70 f2.8 Di3-A VC RXD for the Fujifilm X system. This name makes no sense. I have owned this lens for the past 3 months and it's been my main workhorse lens and probably the best zoom lens I have ever had, especially for the Fuji X mount system. And yeah, let's talk about it. As the name says, the range of this lens is 17-70, which would equal something like a 24-105 on full frame. And it's a constant f2.8 aperture, which is as good as it gets for a Fujifilm zoom lens. To start off, let's talk about the build quality of this lens. I feel that this lens, even though it's mostly made of plastic, is built very well. It feels premium in the hand. The plastic doesn't feel too plasticky, let's say, and it's definitely well built. The only metal bit on the lens is the lens mount, which is all metal and has a rubber gasket because this lens is also weather sealed, so you don't have to worry about carrying it out in the rain or being scared of dust getting into it, which is definitely a big plus. Before owning this lens, I used to have the Sigma 18-50 f2.8, which is not weather sealed, so I was always a bit scared of water and dust getting into it. One thing that all of the die-hard Fuji fanboys will not be happy about is the lack of an aperture ring, but in my use of this lens I don't really care about that. I like using the dials to control the aperture and shutter speed, so I don't really care about the lack of an aperture ring. One thing you have to keep in mind is that to have such a great range at f2.8 with the vibration compensation, this lens is quite big and decently heavy. I would say it's the same size and weight more or less as a 24-70 f2.8 for full frame, which might be an issue for some people that don't like having big bulky lenses on their cameras. And I will say on my X-T3 it does feel kind of too big and make the whole setup too front heavy, but on my X-H2s it feels perfectly at home and fits that camera like it was built for it. Make of that what you want. If you really want a smaller and lighter zoom lens, I would definitely say go for the Sigma, because the Sigma feels like it's half the size and half the weight to this lens, and it was definitely an adjustment for me when switching from the Sigma to the Tamron. Let's talk about image quality. I've used this lens on all of my client shoots and I'm extremely happy with the image quality coming out of this lens. I would say it's more or less the same as my old Sigma 18-50 f2.8, which also performed amazingly, and I basically never had any issues with images being soft or blurry or anything like that. As long as the photo is in focus, it will be sharp. I haven't really shot any charts or anything like that, but from what I see from using this lens, the center is sharp even wide open, and as you stop down, it just starts to get sharper and sharper, and by f5.6 the corners are perfectly sharp as well. One thing that sometimes bothers me with this lens is the lens flare. This thing does flare quite a bit, and I believe it's inevitable with such a long zoom range, but yeah, sometimes the flares can be a bit distracting. I have this one shot from a recent wedding I filmed where I had the bride and groom nicely framed up at 70mm, and there was just this big orange flare over the groom's head, which is kind of unfortunate because in the shot the groom is the one who's talking and the flare washes him out a bit, takes a bit away from the frame. I still use the frame in the final video and it's not a big issue, but I would much rather like if there was no flare on the image, or at least no flare over the groom. Another thing I want to mention is that this lens is not parafocal, so as you zoom in through the range, it doesn't keep focus, which is not ideal for video shooters. And the way I think about using this lens is using it as multiple prime lenses. So you set it up for the frame you need, you shoot your frame, and then you change focal range for the next shot. If you zoom in or out really slowly, you can still keep your subject or whatever it is in focus, but you need to zoom so slow that the autofocus is faster than the zoom. This makes it hard to get a really smooth and continuous zoom pull, which is not ideal for a video lens. I think for how good of a range this lens has and how well it reproduces images, these are some issues that you can overlook. Another amazing thing with this lens is the minimum focusing distance, which is really short throughout the range, and it gives you the ability to get some great shots up close, almost like a macro lens would. It's not as good as the Sigma 18-50 f2.8, but it's really close. So I have no idea what all the letters in the name of this lens mean, but I know that VC stands for vibration compensation, which is Tamron's way of saying this lens has optical image stabilization, which is always a welcome addition to a lens. And for something like my X-T3, this optical image stabilization is definitely a welcome addition because the X-T3 doesn't have IBIS. The vibration compensation helps a lot, especially when zoomed in at 70mm. On the other hand, on my X-H2s, I feel that sometimes the IBIS and the OIS kind of fight and don't really mesh perfectly together and can sometimes give you a bit of a jerky clip, but it's never a big issue because just with turning on the stabilization in Final Cut Pro, it fixes it and it's like you never had any issues. Hopefully in the future with some firmware updates we get that fixed. And while I'm talking about firmware updates, one thing that I don't like on this lens is the lack of an USB port. So as you probably know, most third-party manufacturers give you a USB, either C or the micro USB port on a lens. So the way you have to update the lens is by buying a dock from Tamron, which is something I really don't want to do. If an update with really important improvements comes out, I will probably buy it, but for now I don't need it. The autofocus on this lens feels great. I never had any issues with it and I feel it works the same as a native Fujifilm lens would, so I'm really happy with it both for photos and videos. It does work with the autofocus custom settings of the Fuji cameras. Yeah, basically I never had any issues. Face tracking works and all the subject tracking modes in the Fujifilm X-H2s I have used worked perfectly with it, so it's perfectly fine and indistinguishable from using a native Fujifilm lens. This lens is very competitively priced. A new one will cost you around 600 to 700 euros, while a used one is between 500 and 600. I paid 500 for mine and I couldn't be happier for what I got for that price. And as I've been comparing it to the Sigma 18-50 f2.8, I have to say the Sigma is much cheaper, but you don't get the good stuff like the weather sealing, the longer range and the optical image stabilization. While the Sigma is much cheaper, it's for a reason, so if you don't care about those things, I would say definitely go for the Sigma because it is a great lens, but for me the Tamron is better. And compared to the native Fuji 16-55 f2.8, although I haven't really used that lens, I believe the image quality is quite similar. The Fuji might be slightly better because Fuji glass is always great, but honestly for almost double the price, with the Fuji costing 1200 euros, I think the Tamron still comes ahead with better price, a longer focal range and vibration compensation, so I would still go for the Tamron over the Fuji. Okay, to end it, let's just recap the pros and cons of this lens. So the biggest pro is the great zoom range from 17 to 70, all at f2.8. Another pro is the great build quality and weather sealing, then the vibration compensation and the image quality coming out of this lens. The cons of this lens would be, for some people, the lack of an aperture ring, the big size and weight of the lens, the flaring when shooting backlit scenarios, and the fact that the lens is not parafocal. Anyways, that will be it for this video. Let me know what you think about this lens. For me, it's the perfect zoom lens, at least for now, at least until something much better comes out, which I don't think that it will in the near future, so let's see.